Welcome, everyone. So glad to see those of you I can see. I am Daniela Bleichmar. I am a professor in art history and history at USC, and I direct the Levan Institute for the Humanities, which is sponsoring this wonderful new series on writing. And the Levan is a very, very new institute. It started exactly a year ago, and we had just we were in the process of our initial strategic planning and talking to colleagues and students and figuring out what this new Humanities Institute should look like, and then the world shut down. So for many of you, this may be your first event through the Levan Institute. I want to make sure to share with you the information about the Institute, our website, which I've just posted on the chat. We send a newsletter every 2 weeks with information of events in the arts and humanities and humanistic social sciences across campus. We have created a campus humanities calendar that aggregates everything that is happening at USC, which is much too much for any one mortal, but hopefully you will find things of interest to you. And our focus at the Levan Institute is on humanities scholarship, and in both the results of scholarship, but also the process of scholarship and how we do what we do. And so this new series on writing, which is being coordinated by Emily Anderson and David Yulin, is part of this series of events that are geared to having informal conversations on process and method in the humanities. You can find the schedule for the other events in this series on the Levan webpage. I just posted it on the chat. This is the first of 3 events in the fall, and we will continue the series in the spring. So my thanks to Isabella Carr, Assistant Director of the Levan, who is the person who basically brings this grid together, brings us all together, makes it all happen. And to Emily and David for putting together this wonderful series. And Emily, passing it on.
Sure. I'll speak briefly. David's going to speak briefly, and then we'll just get right to it. So Daniela had approached both David and then myself and kind of put us in conversation on the basis of a survey she'd done with faculty who'd participated in the Levan in the past. And she just asked them kind of, what do you want to hear more about? What are concerns that are pressing on your mind right now? And what she reported back to us was there was this kind of overarching theme, though it took many different kind of manifestations, but just like, we want to talk more about writing. You know, we all do it in some way, shape, or form, but the way it happens is behind the scenes. We don't necessarily work as collaboratively as perhaps our colleagues in the sciences or social sciences, or certainly we could do more of that, or we could at least just kind of come together to share how it is we do what we do. And so that was kind of what she shared with David and myself. And I had just been talking to David in a different context about some writing of my own, and it felt very fortuitous in that sense. And so I'll just say I've loved the opportunity. It's very much a work in progress. And so we want to use this semester's worth of events to kind of get feedback too from you and learn more about like what you'd like to, who you'd like to hear more from, what you'd like to hear more about. I really just want to kind of see where this goes. David, thoughts on that?
I agree. I think, well, you know, I'm always happy to sit in a conversation and talk about writing because it's always much more fun to talk about writing than actually do the writing. So the idea of taking an hour and a half out in the middle of a workday to talk about writing sounds about as good, sounds like it's about as good an escape as we come up with. But yeah, I mean, the idea is, I think Emily staked it out really clearly. We set up 3 events that hopefully build one on the other for this fall. This is you know, about process, about working with editors, about the kind of relationships that get involved, beginning with the relationship of us as writers to our work. And I think, all writers, I shouldn't say all, but many writers I know, and certainly I am fascinated with process. I'm always curious about people's process because I'm always curious about kind of how other people are navigating this really kind of amorphous territory of sitting down to write. What for me it is a process of immersion, and I have to kind of shut off a lot of my conscious or critical thinking, which is hard to do, and allow the piece of writing, the movement of the piece of writing, the issues in the piece of writing, the question at the center of the piece of writing, kind of dictate what that movement is. So I'm always looking to see how other people do it, either for reassurance or so I can beat myself up about not doing it in quite the way that other people do. So that was the genesis of this series, and we thought that for the first one, we would get a range of writers in different territories, dramatic writing, fiction writing, writing also from different disciplines: history, creative writing, drama, American studies, and just sort of have a general conversation both about the differences and the overlaps. So should I mention who the panelists are, or should we? How do you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, housekeeping wise, we've told the panelists all to speak for up to 10 minutes, which should take us roughly to the top of the hour. And after that point, we'll have Q&A. We were going to use the raise hand function, and David and I will keep a running queue if need be. And we'll also ask questions if we need to get the ball rolling on our end, no problem. And we are going to proceed in the order that the panelists are listed on our little program. So sure, David, at this point, if you'd just like to kind of read off who we have among us, and then we can get going.
Hold on, sorry, I muted myself. I believe that Zoom should change its corporate slogan to "You're muted." Anyway, I'm just gonna read quickly so that the panelists can kind of introduce themselves through their talking and their ideas. Our 5 panelists for today are Luis Alfaro from the School of Dramatic Arts, Amy Bender from Creative Writing Department of English, Deborah Harkness from the Department of History, Viet Nguyen from English and American Studies and Ethnicity, and Nyan Shah from American Studies and Ethnicity. And so we're going to run through that. They'll all present as Emily suggested, and then we will have a kind of a loose conversation about practice or whatever comes up in the last part of the program. The only thing I would ask people to do, because since we're in Zoom format as opposed to webinar format, we can't mute all, because we would mute the panelists. So I'm just going to ask everybody to make sure that you are muted, unless you are actually speaking, just so that we don't, because we have about 47 people, which is a nice number, but we will inevitably have background noise. I'm sure I'm not the only person with a yappy dog in the house. So, so if everybody can mute themselves, and then I think we're ready to get started, right? Okay, so Luis, are you good to be our first speaker?
Well, I don't know if I'm good to be our first speaker, but I will be our first speaker. Hi, everybody. I'm coming to you from Koreatown, and my isolation always looks like this, like midnight. So here I am. I'm really, really intrigued by this idea about how we talk about what we do, because practice is very hard for me. But I know that practice is also religion. So that's the meditation for me. The practice is something that I grew up with. I was raised in both the Pentecostal and Catholic traditions, which are both really strict religions. So the idea of ritual is really embedded in my work, which is good, because I think that theater is ritual, theater is political, and theater is social. So ritual really ties into how I work. Religion was also a way of dealing with growing up with extreme poverty. I was born and raised in Pico Union, down the street from USC. And a religion was a way of surviving the violence of poverty. So I think that I'm always thinking about how the work is in some way trying to address a social need as well. I need practice because teaching pulls me away from practice, sometimes really, really far away. So I'm a playwright. And I hardly ever start with the story. I almost always start with the character. And every character to me is a kind of puzzle that I'm trying to unlock. I'm trying to usually find the character's backstory, their history. It's something I'm known for in terms of my writing, and I have a whole series of tricks that I use. So I was mentored by a woman named Maria Irene Fornes, the Cuban playwright. And so Irene was all about working for the subconscious, right? Trying to trick yourself into doing the things you needed to do in writing. So a series of exercises that get you out of your head, which is interesting because in playwriting, there are a lot of voices in my head and I'm trying to make sense of who they are. And I know it sounds like a mental health issue, but it's actually an artistic one. So I am trying to make sense of who these voices are and what they bring. So for me, I rarely ever start with the story. I always start with a character, and the character brings the story, if that makes any sense. I also don't think of myself as a writer that writes alone. So I'm kind of considered a community-based writer. I work with people that I call my community dramaturgs. I am always in community with somebody. So I had about 10 pretty rough years where I went around the country and I lived in different cities in America for up to a year at a time. And there were kind of cities that were having interesting challenges. So I was in Hartford, Connecticut for a year, living in downtown Hartford. I was in Tucson, Arizona, Houston, Texas, Methford, Oregon, which is called the crystal meth capital of the world. So I usually choose a city that's having some really interesting social or political problem going on. And that sort of starts to dig into the worlds of plays. Every play is a new play. I've never written a play before. that's the trick. Every time after I write a play, I say to myself, I've never written a play before. I don't know how to write a play. And so muscle memory takes over. Something new starts in the process of trying to find myself again as a writer. I love that because I've never written kind of the same play twice. In the last 10 years, I've been writing these Greek adaptations that have gone around the country, and they're really born out of situations and communities that I'm in. The other thing that I'm really fascinated by, or that usually launches me as a writer, is a fact. So Oedipus El Rey, which is this play, the adaptation of Oedipus, is really about California state prisons and recidivism rate. Why is it that more than half of all young men 17 to 24 years old in a California state prison go back at least once in their lifetime? And that sort of starts to launch a story. And then I did an adaptation of Medea called Mojada that's been touring the country. And that one was that more than half of all women who cross the southern border undocumented are assaulted. So that starts to change or shift the story for me. And I do have a lot of rituals that I do. Maybe my favorite one is I subscribe to a gentleman named Joseph Chaikin, a wonderful man who's now passed. He has a wonderful book called The Presence of the Actor. And I love the first question that he asks of any character that he creates, which is so beautiful. What is the one thing that people cannot see when they look at you? What is the one thing that people cannot see when they look at you? And that's usually the way I start a play, with a secret that a character is carrying. That secret has intention. That secret is a need and a want. That secret launches the story. And then I just go. Maybe one other thing I'd like to say is that I believe very strongly that there's a kind of holy trinity of idea right now in the theater that I really subscribe to, which is that theater right now is about passion, theater is about point of view, and theater is about craft. And how do we bring all these three things together in the making of our work when we are living really, really isolated lives? So I'm creating work that's meant to be performed in public on stage, given life, right? To be performed in the 3D, the depth of space. But I am writing it in the loneliness of Koreatown Midnights. So, that's probably the practice that I'm most wrestling with right now. How's that to start? Okay? All right. I give it over.
That's great. Thank you so much, Luis. I really appreciate it. All right. So our next presenter is Amy Bender from the Department of English and Creative Writing. Amy.
Thanks, David. And thanks all of you. It's just a pleasure to get to listen to everyone and be a part of this. Luis, it's always so good to hear you. So I guess what I would add to the mix in terms of my approach is a certain kind of boxiness in thinking that seems to be the way that I'm like that. I can't really think about the writing itself. The act of doing it has to be, there has to be some sort of box. And for me, it's a box of time, which I'll talk about more in a couple minutes, but that I rarely can sit down with an intention of what I want to write and write anything that I'm pleased with. It seems to me that in that sort of unconscious space, I'm a much stronger writer than in that more conscious space, which is why I struggled with writing essays at times in school, because my thinking process just gets a little muddled. And so I have to kind of drop down. And in that space, I feel like there's a lot more going on, and there's a lot of connections that get made that I'm not going to make consciously and that are going to show up on the page. So then how to facilitate that kind of thinking, which for me has been a much more fruitful artistic space and ultimately analytical space too. Like that's just where I do the better thinking, is when I'm not in my own way. And for me, that has been creating a kind of box of time where the thing that is rigid and the thing that is set is something that I can control and that I can make rules about, and I can be very intentional about removing any intention about what's going to happen in that time. But that for years, for 17 years, it was 2 hours and 15 minutes. And it was just this like insane system where I would sit down and write on a notepad. I would do the math and write down that 2 hour and 15 minute thing. And then I would write and I would stop. And like, if it was going well, I would stop, and I would stop pretty close to the minute, because that's just how what I'm like. And it was like the material came out in ways that surprised me. And that was so freeing. And that was just like, that's where every book that I've written has come from, that boxiness. And then I had children, and it shrank to 10 minutes a day for a while, and it's back to 10 minutes a day in this pandemic. Like, this is completely the system that I'm leaning on. But as a friend of mine, a writer named Cheston Knapp, that I was telling about the 10 minutes a day when my kids were like 6 months old, he said this beautiful quote that I think about a lot, where he said, 10 minutes is infinitely longer than nothing. And I just really believe that. And I think it's true, because it was like, there was a way to slowly make a short story in 10 minutes that didn't exist clearly until that 10 minutes was set aside. And that there is a kind of rupture in time, a sort of time warp that happens when one sits down to work. And yes, there is a deeper immersion, I think, if you are able to go in for longer, but the inner critic surfaces the longer we're sitting with ourselves. So there is some benefit to just the quick dive in and then the bail out, because stuff shows up on the page that you may not expect, because there isn't time for that inner critic to even show up, because it's such a short little window. So I guess I really espouse this idea that if you can create some kind of structure that works for you, then you can lean and put all the energy into the specifics of the structure. And even if you're just sitting there within that structure, you've created some kind of space to create. And for me, it's a structure of time, but for others, it's word count. Some people, this doesn't work at all. Of course, it's totally specific, but it has worked for me. And what's very lovely is for me to see, like in the audience here, there's several people with whom I've done a writing contract. And I want to just talk about that for a couple minutes too, because I think it's a very similar process. And this was set up long ago by a student of mine who wanted to she was working at an office, and she was like, I want to write up a contract like we do in my office that I'm doing for my job, but I want it to be about my creative work because I'm not doing it. And I want accountability. And so she wrote it up in like overly formal contract language, and we co-signed it. And she wanted a grade, bless her heart. She was like, this is the kind of person I am. After 3 months, I want you to grade me on how well I fulfilled this contract. Because she was like, I'm a good student at heart. And then she and every day she would email me, done. And I would email back, check. And as several people on here know, like this is a system that I've then employed in various classes. And it's been so moving to see the great work that comes out of and I'm not looking at the work directly, but just hearing about it or seeing it in later classes. there's something about that accountability that can be quite powerful. And it's also relational. Like you're having something with a person where you are then saying, I'm doing my work today, and that's what they tell me. And then there's something moving for me to be like, I see that you did your work, and that's the exchange. And it has, you know, there was one that went on for a year. There's, you know, usually it's like a semester long agreement, but it's the same idea. And it's just this kind of subscribing to the idea of how do we use limitations. And obviously this being a time in our lives where we're acutely aware of extreme limitations, and how do we use these limitations creatively to our advantage, and being boxed in a corner in various ways, although oppressive. And you know, right now with the air, the air quality, like there's so many things that we're dealing with in terms of limitations, right? But what are the ways that we can creatively use those to make work happen that might be a little different if you were freer or more open to, you know, being able to leave more and go to different places and all these things that we're navigating. So I think that's just sort of the way that it's helped me and the way that I think about it. And I feel very aware too that this is not for everyone, but I think if it does feel kind of true to the way I feel like it either kind of rings true or it feels like another unhelpful tip. So I think obviously each person weighs that, but that's been generally my approach. I will also say that I think that's the bulk of my speech, and on occasion I'm going to black out my screen because my kids will have to be doing their asynchronous work. So, but I will be back soon, and it's not any sort of, I just want you to know, because I feel sort of, I don't like to do it, but that's my speech.
Great, thank you, Amy. And actually, I think as I was saying to you in email, the kind of, you know, I don't even want to say interruption, the kind of presence of your kids is a kind of three-dimensional illustration of the time stuff you've been talking about. So I love when life and art intersect.
I'm Viet Nguyen. Well, starting off with what Louise said about writing being a practice like a religion or ritual, it really resonated with me because I'm a Catholic. Okay. And if you're a Catholic, either you're praying every day or if you're feeling guilty that you're not praying every day. And to me, that's what writing is like. You know, you hope that you're going to write or pray every day. Sometimes you can only do it for 10 minutes, like Amy said. And many times I don't get to do it at all. And especially when the semester is underway, I'm teaching, I'm grading. You know, many days I'm not actually getting any writing done. And doing events like this. Today, I feel guilty because I only wrote 5 minutes before this event. All right. So I blame all of you. And I blame myself for agreeing to do this event. But there's a positive way to look at these kinds of obligations as well. You know, Amy talked about having kids. I have kids, never wanted to be a father. Now I'm a happy father. And part of the way I'm a happy father is to think that every experience in my life feeds into what it means to be a writer. All the guilt, all the frustration, all the other kind of tasks that make me feel or think or struggle in certain ways, all of that eventually feeds into the writing as well. And in terms of ritual and practice and suffering and guilt, I think that these are experiences that are daily, but they're also experiences that are a lifetime. This is where, you know, Lewis's notion of writing like a religion or ritual is really crucial. I don't think of writing as something that only happens on a given day. I think of writing as something that happens over my entire life. And so I may not be happy in a given day that I didn't do any writing or only wrote for 5 minutes, but I look over my entire life and I think I actually have written for like 10,000 hours, or maybe I haven't written for 10,000 hours, but I've sat in a room for 10,000 hours and thought about writing for 10,000 hours. And this goes to Deb's point, that writing and not writing is a spectrum, you know, and what constitutes writing is very, very fluid. And if you sit in a room and you stare at the wall and you agonize over not writing, it's still kind of writing. And there's no way of getting around it. Just like there's no way of getting around suffering when you're Catholic. You know, you have to suffer for 10,000 hours to really touch the face of God or whatever. And as a writer, I think you really have to suffer for 10,000 hours to become a writer. It doesn't matter whether you do it over 10 years or over your entire lifetime. I think you've got to do it. I don't see a way of getting around that the only way to learn how to write is to write, whether you're an academic or whether you're a creative writer. And that's what happened to me, you know. And for example, you know, I wrote a short story collection called The Refugees. This is how I became a writer of fiction anyway. It took me 17 years to write that book. It'll take you like a day to read it. And that's just the way things are. And it was through the 17 years of suffering and knowing that no one cared about this except for me and my wife that I learned to approach writing as a process, as a religion or a ritual, as Louise said. You know, it wasn't about writing the book in the end. It was about enduring the process of writing the book that made me become a writer and made me realize that writing is actually not about the book or the publication or the recognition or the rewards or the lack thereof. You know, all those things are not writing. Writing is sitting in a room by yourself and enduring it. And I'm so thankful. I wasn't thankful for the 17 years, but in the aftermath that I survived that 17 years, I'm thankful because those 17 years taught me that what matters in the end is the writing and not whether someone reads my book or doesn't read my book or gives me an award or doesn't give me an award. And it's a very hard lesson to learn. Now, the other dimension of myself is that I have a PhD in an academic subject in English, but I'm also, so I'm a scholar, but I'm also a writer of fiction, and I'm a self-taught writer of fiction. And my goal, my personal goal for myself as a writer is to write criticism like fiction and fiction like criticism. I want to see where these two aspects of myself intersect. Because honestly, after I wrote my first academic book, which is a very conventional academic book born out of my dissertation, I thought, if I have to write another book like this, I'm going to quit academia. It is just way too painful. It is not worth it. And this was really devastating because I'd spent like a decade learning how to do this as an academic, as we all have to do. And then in the end, I just wanted nothing more to do with this. So in order to save myself as a writer, I had to learn how to write from a place that gave me joy. Even if there's a lot of pain wrapped up with writing, there had to be joy in there. So the creative writing dictum that you have to find your voice, although it's kind of a cliche, is actually really kind of true. It was true for me both as a writer of fiction, but also as an academic. To save myself as an academic, I had to find my voice, not the voice that was born out of getting a PhD and writing for my committee and writing for my discipline, but a genuine voice that was true to the project that I wanted to do. And, you know, basically, besides being a Catholic, my background is that I'm a refugee, and both these experiences induced tremendous guilt. Okay, like as a refugee, there was no way, you know, I would go home to my refugee shopkeeper parents and say, you know what, I really would just want to write about the Romantic poets, Mom and Dad. It just made no sense. So I felt like I had to find a way of writing that would justify my existence to my parents and to what they had suffered and gone through. Which is, so like Louise, a lot of my writing is very socially and politically committed. And that's, you know, very acceptable in academia. It's much more problematic in the world of American fiction, which is sort of, you know, generally speaking, allergic to social and political commitments. And so I had to confront that and really try to figure out how to be a writer of fiction who could tell stories and yet who could also be deeply committed to the idea that politics could work at the level of fiction. And that was a big struggle to learn how to do that, because again, I think a lot of the discussion around writing in American letters does not talk about how do you write about politics in letters. It's like, well, how do you create a character? How do you create a scene? How do you deal with time? All of which are crucial craft questions, but writing about politics is also a craft issue too, that speaks much more deeply to our very conception of what writing is supposed to be. So that was a big struggle for me. And then the other struggle for me was to go back to something that George Eliot wrote in Middlemarch, to understand that feeling is an organ of knowledge. That's just so beautifully put. Because my experience in academic training was that I had to learn how to stop feeling. You know, I came into academia very passionate, very full of conviction. And by the time I finished my PhD, I was a professor, I was a professional. So I stopped feeling, and as a way of coping, and as a way of, you know, my understanding of being a scholar was you have to be objective, which means you have to get rid of all your subjectivity. And that's completely wrong. I think it's completely wrong. And I had to, as a human being, as a writer, as an academic, as a teacher, go back and recover, and I'm still trying to recover this, or learn how to feel. And learning how to feel is enormously important if you're going to write fiction, obviously, but I think it's also enormously important for me as an academic. Like the last academic book I wrote was Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, and it was born from a space of deep struggle and deep feeling. And that book to me was my book as an academic, where I partly learned my voice, because number one, I felt that it wasn't enough just to do analysis and critique. I had to tell a story. and I had to tell a narrative, and I had to feel something about my subject deeply. And then the book I'm writing now, and I'll end with this, is a book that expresses some of the things that Deb was talking about. You know, like, well, everything is a form of writing, and we should stop feeling guilty that just because we're not doing something conventional, whether it's fiction or academic writing, that it's not writing. Like, I spent a lot of time writing tweets and Facebook posts, which you could interpret as just a waste of time. But no, I mean, I think of drafting ideas in this fashion and also reaching people. It's a different genre of writing. And honestly, like, the book that I'm writing right now owes a lot to social media. So for example, when Spike Lee's The Five Bloods came out, I live tweeted my reactions to that movie. And then that turned that into a 2,000-word essay for the New York Times. But I think I'm just going to drop the live tweets into my book, because that's a very genuine kind of reaction. It's a very genuine kind of critique. So everything that we do, I think, can be interpreted as a form of writing. So for last 3 or 4 years, I've done a lot of speeches and interviews and op-eds and things like this that are not conventional kinds of writing. But in fact, all that stuff is stuff that I'm taking and I'm putting into this nonfiction book. And so I think for me, it was really crucial to try to figure out how to take all these different elements and aspects of my life, my social political commitments, my desire to reach out to different audiences in different media, and think that all of these were drafts of writing that I would somehow be able to get a book out of. And that's where I'm at right now. So I'll turn it over to Nyan.
Great, thank you, Viet. And Nyan, you are...
Yeah, I'm here, I hope. Great to hear everyone speak about their writing process. When Emily asked me to do this, she said to me, hey, you keep on writing, but you were chair of a department, or you've done all this administrative work. And I thought, yeah, I don't know how I did that. I do know how I did that, or I knew that what happened was I had to think about time and space differently. I had to, following a little bit of what Viet just said, I had to think about whatever writing I was doing is the form that a thought emerges in. And that's, you know, a quote out of Joan Balker's book on dissertation writing. And she's probably done various different versions of this. But it's been interesting to me that I had to grieve several times through the last several decades about the way in which I wrote something that I felt very excited about, that was part of my creative process, that I was not able to replicate anew. That in fact, I discovered that every time and space is in flux when I try to bring myself to be persistent in the space of writing. So what worked for me as a dissertator, what worked for a particular article that I loved, writing or creating, what worked for any number of the books I've been writing or have, you know, I'm just working on now, was going to be different. And in some way, I try to think of that as a little bit of a relief, because I don't think I can hold myself, or I could try, but I won't hold myself. And I really appreciate Amy saying this about, you know, sometimes it's the 2 hour and 15 minutes and sometimes it's just the 10 minutes. I just wanted to be able to acknowledge and celebrate when I was in the writing and it was shifting and changing in a patterned way over time. And I think this is something that's been really important to me during the pandemic, because I've been really reflecting on where I was finding spaces that felt like they were stoking my creativity, and which ones I was having to give up. So I felt like, this week, I've been giving up swimming. Swimming was a great place for working out ideas, being immersed in a different environment, and suddenly things would percolate. Or I used to use, the Huntington Library Research Center is fine. The garden's amazing. Not running into people in the garden is amazing. I dread actually going to lunch because I'll see people and might stop what I was thinking about. But I love walking in the gardens because it's a place where ideas get ruminated on. I get distracted, but in a kind of way which over time becomes familiar because I know the routes there. And I'm slipping in and out of dealing with the problem, the thought, the question, the ache, the feeling that Viet was talking about, and trying to really assess how uncomfortable I feel in the moment of revealing it to myself, right? Putting it in writing, but also the moments which just spark joy. So I found that the time that I used to think I need to have one set space for my writing, that I had to write in this room. And that fell apart the more, maybe the more space I got, or, you know, I rotate through my entire house and all over as to where I write. I frustrate my partner terribly. You know, he's always trying to figure out what am I doing and why am I doing it there. But and he says, he jokes, I have many different desks. But I have to appreciate that there's certain desks, there's certain spaces in which I'm actually able to develop an idea. And some places are better for writing memos. Other places are better for ruminating through research. And since I research a lot before and while I write, and my drafting is really to make the research, the other people's voices as a historian, the context my own in the levels of writing, I'm at this stage which I'm liking to feel like is the end stage of finishing a long-term book. And I'm finally feeling like I'm in the flow of writing that feels like it's breaking apart all the fixities that I put in front of myself about what this project had to be, how it needed to be written, what needed to be the voice or the emotion of it. I'm writing right now about a topic of hunger striking across the globe for 100 years. I'm trying to understand viscerality and feeling and how it's communicated. I'm looking at and exploring and experiencing hunger strikers' voices written and recorded at different times in the process, sometimes in the moment by people who are trying to contain, confine, and treat them, and sometimes in memoirs or writing or notes that come out over months and years and that are always mediated. So how do I deal with that material that is so full of pain and anguish, as well as a kind of persistent hope beyond anything I could summon for myself? I can hardly fast for 24 hours. So trying to go into that space, trying to stay in a space like that and still find things that are, that can move me passionately and not just sort of sink me into more despair, I've realized that a lot of what I need to do is dwelling in the writing as I'm writing and then finding other places for my creative process to emerge. And I find that I've learned much more in the last 6 or 7 years how to always have pen and paper nearby, how to use the phone's audio recording. So I'm running errands or I'm in swimming or walking or something. I can jot down some persistent or puzzling ideas. I can wake up from a dream or a nightmare and I can write something down. Believe me, this is stuff that I've heard about for years. Other people do it. I thought, oh my gosh, it's amazing. I feel so lame to not be able to do it. But now I do it as part of my process that I can now appreciate. And it's been interesting to do it in places that I both, I like to go to and now I'm grieving I can't go to. Like, I'm just thinking about the fact that some of my best writing thinking happened in May and June, deep in the Angeles National Forest, when we were escaping this location to hike, places that are now consumed by fire and smoke. And in those spaces, I was connecting ideas and thoughts about an introduction that was just impossible for me to put my head around. And part of the impossibility for me was that I was really dwelling in this idea that this introduction had to actually be more fully my voice. Why was I taking the reader through this journey. It wasn't a rehearsal of various different hunger strikes, but what was it that I was seeing? What was my point of view? What did I want to share with the reader? What did I feel so sure about? What did I feel so troubled about? What were the problems and paradoxes? So I think in that process, you know, those hikes were long. They were strenuous, going uphill, staying in the moment of an idea, talking it through with my partner or friend, pausing and halting frequently when there's just a flood of thought that's coming through. But that wasn't the only part of the process. That was about going back later and trying to make sense. What the heck was I writing when I was in that kind of reverie? And then trying to locate my feeling and let it be inspired anew as I look over my notes and then try to rework it and reprocess it. I also wanted to say something about the page or the text on the computer. I write sometimes longhand and then put it in the computer. I write on the computer and stuff like that. I write thousands, it feels like, words over time that are really messy. I've been learning that organizing my writing, rewriting it, repositioning it has been such an important part of what I do. And that I also have learned something about editing, which is that I will, like always, we're lancing off ideas and thoughts or half-formed things, but there's a set of things that are very ephemeral or have just begun to develop, and they're half-formed, they're awkward, they often happen in a kind of free write zone that, you know, Deb and Luis and Amy and Viet have all talked about in different kinds of ways. They may have been intentioned for something else. And I've been learning to use a file that I just keep calling whatever the chapter is or whatever the topic is, overflow. And in overflow, everything goes. Everything I'm trying to lose, everything I'm trying to shave off. Going back to overflow is the best, because overflow is like better than the little drive that's supposed to be in the what is it? The drive, you know, the sort of idea that there's somewhere out there, you know, there's something that's picking up and saving everything. You know, overflow is interesting because overflow is what I discarded. Overflow is what I gave up on. Overflow, though, sometimes is the place where I have a protective crouch around something that's super special, that's super embarrassing maybe, or difficult, or it's maybe too weak, but I can go back to that text and I can restring it together with some other ideas. And that has been probably the best thing about over successive time when I lose track of the project I'm supposed to be invested in and involved in, when I'm teaching or I'm administrating or whatever else we all do. That's the place where the forlorn ideas that I've removed actually become the gems. They become the thing that I'm really most excited about, the thing that took the longest to work through. And it's that where the scraps and the debris are that I find the true worth of what my thinking has been, my creative process has been. And that's been so amazing for me to appreciate, that it isn't just the time and space I located and defined as most important in the moment, but what I later discovered in my own keeping and collecting that became the germ of the idea or the expression of a problem or the thing that kept me so worried and so maybe disturbed and distraught that I didn't know yet what to do with it or how to share it. And that's where I've been finding some amazing work that writing that I feel like I'm really able to communicate out in ways that I'm now feeling much more confident about. So I share that just as a way of sort of talking about, you know, this contribution to our conversation. I'm really looking forward to hearing what other people have to ask or say. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Nayan. And thank you all. Thanks to everybody, all the panelists, everybody who presented. This has given me a lot to think about. I've got notes And I certainly have some questions. But now what we want to do is open it up to questions from all of you. So I'll kind of supervise this for the moment, but what would be best, I think, is just use the raise hand icon, like, you know, in the participants queue, and raise your artificial blue hands, your virtual blue hands, and we'll call on you in the order in which the questions show up. So I'll give everybody a minute or so to do that, and then we'll kind of move this conversation into the group realm. While I'm waiting, I just have I have a bunch of questions, so I'll just throw one out. Nyan, I wondered about the overflow question. Are you're finding the source of your thinking there, which I find really interesting. I always love going back, and I save everything I cut, and I often go back, and not even that I necessarily use it, but I'm sort of curious about it if I'm working on a project or stuck. How does that overflow material, or does it end up involving itself in the finished work? Or is it more a kind of context thing for you in terms of your own thinking?
It does two things. Overflows are things I've given up. So sometimes I actually use it as an affirmation to why I gave it up. It was the context of why I pared something down in a certain way. It's why I took part of the quote and didn't take the whole thing. It's why I spent 2.5 pages trying to write about someone else's idea and then realized there's a kernel of it that's actually really interesting to me, and then I actually am engaging it to make it my idea. So sometimes it's just that memory. But the other thing that happens in overflow, and this was true for my introduction, I guess that's what's really on my mind right now. I put so many things in different chapters that were larger ideas, or bolder propositions, or unhinged thoughts. And particularly unhinged thoughts as a historian. It's like, oh my gosh, how unhinged do you want to get before you become a political commentator, right? But those were the places where I assembled things from there. There were these kernels, there were these half phrases that I thought, oh, I've actually been trying to think about prisoner's voice or prison power in a particular way. When I say visceral communication, I'm beginning to understand what everyone else is saying about affect and feeling and emotion. But when I'm thinking about visceral communication, this is what I mean by it. You know, I was beginning to able to do that in ways that were locked into the overflow document. So it was an interesting process. It was, you know, to answer your question, dual then. It was both a reminder of what I had done and maybe affirming that or understanding that, and then also an invocation to deal with some really particularly difficult problems, or my own voice, maybe more so, in overflow, as opposed to what I thought overflow was, which was other people's voices.
I just love the concept of what it tells you about the process and how, you know, I mean, I think of, you know, my own writing. I mean, I read old pieces of writing and I immediately want to revise them and edit them. I have to force myself not to. And so the idea of the work always being somehow conditional or always being in a state of process, I think is really important and really useful. So thank you so much. Alice Baumgartner, you have your hand up. So
great. Thank you so much for such a wonderful event. And I apologize for not turning on my video. I've been having internet troubles galore. But Amy mentioned the inner critic and how that tends to come out in the longer stretches of time that you spend writing. And I would love to hear from all of the panelists, or any who are interested in responding to this, how you deal with that inner critic when it arises.
Anyone who wants to jump in, feel free. Just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot because, you know, we actually have critics who show up to our plays and destroy us in processes. But I will say that a concept or an idea that I do follow through on that makes the writing longer and harder but more rewarding is the embracing failure. So, you know, I always feel that writing is kind of like jumping off a cliff or walking through fire. You know, I always have these images in my head. And the idea that I embrace failure in the writing allows me to only do learning and recovery. I'm always in an active recovery. That's like a living theater concept, right? That's an entire company built this as a way of working. And I love it as a way of working too, because it makes me critic proof. the truth is I'm always in process. I'm never in product, but I'm in a business of product, right? And when I write for television or I'm writing for something else, they always sort of annoyed with me because of this. But my best work really happens in the failure part, in the recovery, in the second go around, in the rewrite, right? If that makes sense. So every time I go to like a playwrights conference, you know, I always say this first draft, okay. And everybody goes, oh my God, this guy, I feel so bad for him, right? And then you kind of walk out with the play you can get produced. But you have to give yourself the opportunity to embrace failure. I love it. When I first started here, you know, one of my first classes I pitched was a class called Failure, because I had taught a solo performance course here where I did a exercise where I said 2 minutes of the worst solo performance ever. And it was probably the most extraordinary, transgressive, perverse class I've ever taught, but it was amazing. It was all discovery, right? It was all discovery and recovery, which is what I think writing is a lot of times, right? So just to say that in some way, the critic can't enter the room for me because I'm never finished.
Well, I think there's a role for the inner critic for me at the revising stage. I call that the editor. You know, you have to have some capacity to criticize yourself and to edit yourself. That's really crucial. But for me, I think what's really important about the inner critic is to not listen to the inner critic when I'm first writing a draft, and to respond intuitively and viscerally, trying to, again, going back to the idea of feeling, you know, just get the words out. And the only way to get the words out sometimes is to turn off that inner critic, because the inner critic will tell you, you shouldn't say this, you shouldn't say that. And that inner critic is partly coming from the world of convention and of discipline and your imagination of what your peers or the authorities are saying. And oftentimes what they're saying, you know, sometimes it's right, obviously, but sometimes it's also the voice of convention is wrong because it's telling you you shouldn't say something that you know is true. And so that's where I think the getting rid of the inner critic is really crucial. Just put the words on the page. And then later you can decide what's worth it, what's worth having, what is actually a good intuition, what's a bad intuition, because sometimes there can be a bad intuition, and that's what the inner critic, that's what the editor is there to help you think through. But you can't have that conversation with the editor until you've actually got the words out there. And I think that's really, it is something hard for people to confront, you know, as a writer. You have to respond, you have to give voice to things that you might be afraid of giving voice to. And in the end, you might decide, well, certain things shouldn't be said, but there are certain things that other people don't want to say that need to be put out there. And you're not going to be able to tap into that until you silence that inner critic on the initial round.
Can I chime in on this too, just real quick? I think that makes so much sense what you just said. Yeah, you can hear me, right? I just put on the, okay. And just to add a thought too, that I think so much I think about writing process is also learning about your own relationship to the work and what it looks like at a given time, and when is a productive space, and when, like Viet's saying, is that critic being a useful, rigorous kind of way to think about your work in a later point, and when is it simply destructive? And sometimes that inner critic is just like out to ruin the thing. And I think it's perfectly legit when you feel that shift in the process. What I'll do is I'll start working on something else. Like, I just feel like I don't want to try to get in that war. That thing has been corrupted for that moment. So I'll shift to something else. And it can be 5 minutes later that I feel like able to return to the thing, or it might be the next day or whenever. But I just feel like there's sometimes, I think, a notion that we're supposed to stay on point and supposed to like be in the thing and get to the end of the thing. And if you're really paying attention to how the work, your relationship to the work in that moment, you can kind of tune into saying, no, I'm gonna have to undo everything I do to the work tomorrow if I keep at it, because I know I'm not in a creative space with this thing right now. It is not a productive kind of review that I'm doing. And so there's just something about, the more I feel like the more that gets noticed and thought about, then the more you can create the circumstances that facilitate that writing space that is successful for you, the more you can be like, oh, right, I really, you know, whatever these things are, whatever these factors are that create the space that you can get the best work done, that learning curve, I think, is crucial.
Yeah, and I just want to say I really appreciate, because I operate this way too. I really appreciate all of you sort of talking about the necessity at times of just walking away. I mean, I don't, I think that we feel like we've been taught that if, we walk away, somehow we're giving up or we're giving in, or it's, it's weak, we're not wrestling with the problem. But I've had that experience too, of forcing myself to sit at the desk and writing, several pages that I knew were terrible as I was writing them. And that, I knew the next morning I was going to get rid of all of them. And sure enough, that's exactly what I did. And I think that knowing when to kind of stop and go do something else is a really important part of the process as well. So I'm really grateful to hear that. Lisa Pon.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry that I'm not on view either. I'm having some internet issues myself. But I wanted to first of all thank everyone for the wonderful comments that they've put in. So many ideas resonate with me about how and when and where we write. And in particular, the viscerality of writing is something that's been really close to me. A couple of years ago, I blew out my Achilles tendon, and I thought actually I would do a lot of writing because I was immobilized, unable to get up from my desk literally, but that actually didn't happen. And I understood at last that writing is actually a full body practice. It's not just a mental practice. It takes everything and every part of me. And then the idea of this critic that could be external or also could be internal. I've written some things where I've had my pinking finger of my right hand on the delete key. So every word I wrote got deleted immediately. And until I realized that this was probably not going to be a very productive process. So the question of when to turn off the internal editor. But my question for you is sort of, I have two questions, I guess. One is, sometimes there is an external critic who needs to be appeased, right? Yes, that tenure review board is going to look and see if you finished that thing. Sometimes there is a deadline that we have to face, and we are not able to enjoy the more organic processes that we might like and thrive under. And the other thing, I actually do feel quite bereft in this company, this very talented company. I do not have a novelistic voice. I do not have a poet's voice. My writing, at least now, is only academic. But I really do want that voice to be my voice, and that voice not to be an unfeeling voice. That voice, I want my book on my academic, discipline to sound like me and not this great scholar or that great scholar. I want it to be my book. And how can we marry the urge for academic writing to remove our voice, as well as remove feeling as a way of thinking and teaching our students? I mean, I had a student write that she found an article I assigned annoying. And I said, well, that means that writer has done something useful. She's made you feel. And this student was appalled that I would say that, just appalled, So I'm going to stop there. But these are the two questions I had for you. The external critic that really is there and needs to be attended to, and the marrying of our personal voice, even in our disciplinary writing. Thanks.
I don't think you have to be a poet or a novelist to write with feeling in academia. And this is my one, if I had one thing to say, is like, you don't have to do that. It's like academic writing can be full of passion and feeling and so on and so forth. And there are actually a lot of models for this, obviously. And I'm not trying to, say that we shouldn't be objective as best as we can, obviously. And there are models of, deeply researched, objectively written academic scholarship in which you can still feel the voice and the passion of the scholar for what they have done, right? But then there's also other kinds of models of academic writing in which it's very explicitly trying to be, unique and creative and idiosyncratic. So there's a whole spectrum of possibilities. And I think it's crucial to, for those of us who are scholars, to expose ourselves to this kind of writing, but also to expose our students to this kind of writing as well. I mean, I have many, many suggestions as to the kind of writers, you could turn to. And, now there are people who are coming out, writing books about how to write as an academic. The one I'm currently reading is Amitabha Kumar's Every Day I Write the Book. And Kumar is both a novelist, but also a very serious scholar and an essayist as well. So the resources are now increasingly out there. And I think that hopefully there is a wave of, especially among younger scholars and graduate students who don't feel as if there's only one way to be an academic, there's only one way to write, and I find inspiration from a lot of younger people who are, you know, writing for newspapers, social media, et cetera, because they know that even in the world of academia, their chances of getting a job are so limited that they can't just put all of their hopes into this one, being this one kind of academic.
I think that's great as what Viet's saying, and I think that it's important to also appreciate the range of different kinds of writing we do. But I want to sort of take up the critic as like the deadline, or as the academic, you know, interlocutor, however that's sort of happening. And one thing I learned over the last several years, as I both was involved in like editing a journal, reviewing people's files, helping them through the promotion process here, how to write readers' reports, how to respond to readers' reports, was a kind of idea that what often is missing, if you feel like a reader's report or a kind of a criticism that's waged in that direction, which in fact, as many people know, readers' reports have this kind of horrible viscerality sometimes. You know, they're where people in anonymity say all kinds of things, but sometimes they clarify a problem or a contradiction in your work, and you are very upset about that. You're like, I didn't mean to do that. I meant to do X. And when you respond to, I meant to do X, it's sometimes the clearest statement of what you want to do and where it is that your work may not be getting there for the reader. Sometimes that reader is acutely obtuse and resistant. Sometimes that reader is only seeking a certain kind of form for their pleasure or their interest. But at other times, it's really an interesting moment. And I try to help people through this process. I try to help myself through this process of responding to really strong readers' reports, or trying to articulate what my project is and what its contribution is for an academic entity, to say that's the place where my voice matters the most. And maybe I haven't yet gotten there. How can I get there? What kind of work or exercise or dialogical conversation do I need to get there? And I believe that that kind of responding, that approach to responding, the knowing that you don't have to explain everything you do, but you have to express your intentionality or your purpose or the problem in some way that's clear and vivid. Now that's a struggle for all of us in every form of writing. And I try to think that that's a more helpful way of responding to that kind of critic. I also think it's important to understand how one copes with deadlines. That is, I began to realize a pattern in my life at certain times where I was off the deadline by a couple of days, although I made myself visibly and you know, in my body sick with the fact that I was going to miss this deadline or I was coming to it, that I had to acknowledge both things, that I actually needed something to get myself going towards a deadline, but I didn't completely blow it off. Oh, once or twice. But, you know, but I got close and I began to realize, oh, my pattern is. So then I try to understand a little bit of what I'm doing in terms of that pattern and trying to understand like, oh, does this mean that I'm kind of a week off from what I thought I would, a month, you know, a couple of days? What does that mean about my creative process and what I'm putting myself through? And what of that can I honor and say, okay, this is my discipline. This is where, and this is, or what things do I need to change? And sometimes it's changing my outlook, you know, about it and about whatever the feelings I have about it. And also trying to figure out strategies of communicating it to the people that are near me, and also communicating it to the people I have to deal officially with. And sort of trying to explain, you know, trying to get really good about like, sorry, I'm going to miss this by 2 days, or I'm going to try to do this. You know, but also just the people around you. I don't know about all of you, but I feel like I'm very aware of the fact that my writing creative process has a lot of impact on the people that I'm with. And sometimes for the good, but often, you know, I need to be a better at a communicator about what's going on. And so I don't, you know, I don't ricochet it off someone else, which might be my process, but those are my thoughts.
Great, thank you. All right, Ruth, Ezra, you have your hand up.
Hi, thank you all for your generous and candid responses thus far. I just have a question to sort of bring it back to process. I know that maybe a couple of you already spoke to this, but I'm really interested in the way in which process and practice and sort of experiments in process and practice can lead to experiments in form, or how the, you know, the limitations of process, say maybe the 10 minutes, can then lead to a more fragmentary form. And I can think in my own discipline of art history of one quite sort of discussed example of a diaristic mode, so making the quotidian into something that's actually the final product of scholarship. So if you could just speak to, you know, this generative relationship of practice to form.
All right. Anyone who wants to take that is welcome.
I think one of the problems of our graduate training is, and this is my own experience, maybe it's different for other people, is that we tend to expose graduate students to only one kind of writing, which is, you know, academic monographs, which are very conventional. And that was my own fault for not reading more widely when I was a graduate student. But you know, when you read more widely outside of the academic conventions, you see all kinds of experiments with form taking place that are done by very intelligent people who just are not academically conventional. And that's very liberating. You know, for example, I don't know who you're talking about in particular, but like Wayne Kostenbaum is a pretty good, pretty intelligent writer who engages in all kinds of fragmentary, diaristic, short forms of writing. And you know, part of the danger, obviously, as Lisa brought up, is that it's problematic for graduate students to write in this way, or for assistant professors to write in this way, because there's external forms of punishment that are waiting to literally discipline them. But after you have tenure, you have no excuse. That's my big beef, is with people who have tenure and who do the same thing that they've done before and do nothing to change the conventions of the field. You have no excuse. Expose yourself to different kinds of writing, you know. And that could be anything from the essayistic to the aphoristic to the social media, to people with PhDs who have chosen not to write within academia. Again, there's so many writers who are doing these kinds of things. And you know, we learn to write partly by writing those 10,000 hours, but we learn to write also by reading. And you have to immerse yourself in your discipline and your genre, obviously. But you also have to read across genres. This is true whether you're a fiction writer or whether you're an academic writer. You got to read across genres, read different kinds of people or different kinds of things who are going to push your buttons, but are also going to expand your horizons too.
Luis?
I was just going to say something quick. You know, in this moment in our department, we're dealing with a lot of racial reckoning. And it's very interesting because as we start to shift the curriculum, the form changes radically. And so now just we see something like an Arthur Miller next to a Susan Laurie Parks. And we're really starting to play with form in a beautiful way. So last semester I did a textual analysis course where I only did playwrights 25 years or younger. And there was not a single play that looked or read or just literally on the page looked like what we call the well-written play. And it was refreshing and exciting and speaking to this generation of young writers who are studying. So something is shifting. And, you know, almost sometimes in the department, you have to force the shift, right? So I agree with Viet that the minute I got tenure, it all shifted. Yeah, the punishment stopped and the experimentation really could take off. I'll deny that later when my department asks me about it. But that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, but this is being recorded, so you know it's all up in the cloud. All right, we're going to go to Daniela, who had a question but wasn't able to raise her hand by virtue of the vagaries of hosting the meeting.
It's sort of amazing because I had this question after the initial comments, but we've circled really to what I wanted to ask, which was sort of the intersection of various things that you guys said about writing being sort of a life's work that has different moments at which it happens in different modes, and that has to do both with personal circumstances, right? Whether you have a newborn or you don't, or whatever your personal circumstances are, it has to do with professional circumstances, but it also has to do with the practice, right? What you guys were saying about what you can do at different moments and what you want to do. And so, and we haven't talked about also writing as a way to earn a living, right? Like the economics of it have not been mentioned, as if, we're all funded, or, as academics by the teaching, and then we do the writing. But that's also a constraint. There are people here. I mean, I guess part of what I was saying is, I was thinking was listening to you guys and then looking at who is here and seeing that we have grad students and postdocs and assistant professors and tenure professors and professional writers who are not supported by work at a university, and their income comes from selling their books. And so I wanted to hear about sort of how to think about what you might do as a writer at different points, that is taking the constraints and working with them, but putting your own development as a writer at the center of it, right? Rather than saying, oh, I have to write a dissertation, otherwise I will, whatever happens. Being like, okay, so I'm writing a dissertation. As a writer, what does that mean? I'm writing a tenure book. I have 6 years to write this. So this is the most inchoate question, but sort of the intersection of different moments in a practice of writing and the both external and process of writing, how they inform each other. Sorry, I couldn't put it into a question. You all look confused. I'm so sorry. I haven't had lunch. That's my excuse.
Does anyone want to jump in on that?
I will say that there was a period, well, I have a very specific grief period of writing now. The period I wrote before my father died and the period after my father died. So all my writing shifted and changed. I'm a different person. I'm a different writer. Everything has shifted in my field because of that. But also I don't think of it in chapters, I think of it in waves. So I think that there was a wave that was the 80s, where my wave of 10 years of where I really earned the gray hair, where it was nonstop writing, and it was about survival. I live very, very cheap and very simply in a 650 square foot apartment. And I do that because I think I've kept the same model for my writing since the beginning, right? That just always I am eking out a living, which makes me write. I'm always in the passionate, desirous, and hungry, literal hungry mode of writing. So that's always I have to write a play or else I'm not going to eat next year. So there's that going on, right? And I think maybe that comes from growing up in absolute poverty, but I also think it has to do with how do I keep making the work, and how do I not stop the process of movement in the work. So I love theater because theater is a process of movement, right? And so maybe all of these thoughts that you're saying right now, I always think about that weird line of rejecting everything that I have to do in order to write, but also knowing that I literally just have to write. The practice is the job, the business. Right? I get up every morning and I do this religious thing. I'm going to stick with the religious model right now. I get up every morning and I literally open my eyes and I say, thank God that I have the ability to get up and do work, to labor. The labor is the writing. That the spiritual practice is the thing that makes me money is extraordinary to me. But somehow, the fact that I bring it down to something like that base allows me to never stop working. I've never stopped working. I never planned a career. I just, those crazy things that happen to you, like MacArthur and all that, none of those happened really when I was at my hungriest and my most rejectful of an industry, right? They happened because I needed to write out of real necessity, both spiritual and physical. And when those two kind of come together, I think that's when I make my best work.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I just want to say we're basically just about out of time. So I want to make sure that we're respectful of everybody's time and don't run over. But I also want to say, I mean, I also, you know, have written my whole life for a living, and I've always been amazed by the idea, as you say, that the thing that I would be doing anyway is a thing by which I, you know, feed myself and my kids. And there is a real pragmatic factor. You don't write, you don't get paid, you don't get paid, you don't eat. And it's an amazing antidote for writer's block, I think. So that quality of necessity. And I do also want to say just very quickly, the idea of demystifying it and making it the job, for me at least, as someone who grew up wanting to be a writer and idolizing writers, made it accessible to me because I knew how to go to a job, I knew how to go to work, and I knew how to do a shift. And I might not be able to write as well as the people I admired, but I knew how to sit in the chair and do the job. And so that allowed it to become accessible. And I think that that's a really important point. Emily, can I bring you in to kind of talk about what our next event, I know it's in the chat, but our next event, which
Certainly.
is October 14th.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just say, and again, it segues so nicely from the final comments and the ideas that were being shared. And I love the fact that people were sharing all that in the chat. I hope there's a way to maybe copy paste, grab some of those title recommendations. And I'll talk to Daniela maybe about something we could do to formalize that. But our next event is on October 14th, and it's specifically on the range of writing, this idea kind of being fluid or flexible in the form that our writing takes. And we're featuring a mix of people from USC and beyond. So Karen Thompson in ACE in English, Sarah Knott, who's a historian at University of Indiana, Leah Brody, who's in English here, Josh Kuhn, who's at Annenberg, and Amitava Kumar, who's at Vassar in English. So I hope you guys, some of you can tune in, and thank you so much for coming today. It was a great start.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.